Thank you all for coming to our annual election results party. My name is Michelle Barney. I'm the president of the Marin Women's Political Action Committee, and I'm very glad we have a great turnout, as we usually do, for this event. I'm just going to be very brief. I'm going to introduce Dottie Lemieux, who is going to be our moderator this evening, Jeanne MacLeamy, who is Novato City Councilwoman, Greg Brockbank, who is prior San Rafael City Councilman and Marin College board member, and Brad Breithaupt, who is the Marin Independent Journal opinion page editor. So once again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all for being here. I hope you're enjoying your dinner. We're going to start with the program now, I think, while you're still having dinner. So enjoy. What we're going to do is each person is going to have a chance to make an opening statement if they want to about their impressions of the past election, either locally or nationally. But then they don't have to, but they can just say their name. And then we're going to, I think this moves, so I'm going to pass it around. But first of all, and the most important thing, is in the front of the room are some membership forms. And those of you who are not yet members, I'm also the membership chair of this organization. We would love to have you join. Dues are $40 a year, and we're a very lively organization. We're having our holiday party on the 8th, and here's an invitation to that. It should be at each of your tables. I hope to see you there. That doesn't cost anything, except a potluck. And membership is $40 a year, and it's a really good deal, and you get to vote on endorsements for the people, many of whom are in this room tonight, because we endorse them, I like to think. We certainly contribute to their causes, and as a member you get to do that. So we are going to just start with Jeannie, because she's sitting here, and then we're going to go down here, and each one's going to just introduce themselves, say a word or two, or if they don't want to, they can say I don't want to. I'm going to throw it open for questions. I am going to, what? Men may join. Men may join, yes. Anybody pro-choice and support women in office. Those are the two main things that we do in this organization. So men are welcome, and it's nonpartisan. So it doesn't matter what party you belong to or if you belong to no party. And at any age, we'll take some more younger people anytime. But I'm going to start with Jeannie. She can say whatever she wants, and we're going to just pass it down. And okay, people, listen. And then we're going to take questions from the floor. And when you ask your question, please try not to make a speech. Just ask a question as succinctly as you can. You can ask each panelist or one if you just have a question for one. And I'm going to try to call on people in order, and I'm going to try to let people speak who haven't had a chance to speak before the person gets to speak twice. So take it away, Jeannie.
Okay, well, thank you all for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be back again. And I've got two pros up here, so I'm just going to see how well I can do just to have a few comments. We did not have any specific items on the election in Novato this year.
Since June.
Since June. But in looking at the local elections, I noticed that 70% of the local tax measures did pass. And I know last year we were really surprised that a lot of the taxes passed then also, even though there was all the discussion about pensions being causing unsustainable budgets and so forth, but people were still willing to tax themselves, and it looks like that's still the case. Paramedic taxes got, they won by over 70%, and public safety continues to be an issue, and maintenance of infrastructure. And people always want good schools, so they're usually willing to put their money out, although there were several that did not pass. I think the whole pension issue came up with MIRA. And as yet, I don't believe we yet know what the final outcome of MIRA is. And I assume there probably wouldn't have been much trouble in getting that extra little boost and passing it without this delay had it not been for the Citizens for Sustainable Pension Reform. However, in talking with people, I found that they were concerned about several things. Some of the things that the Citizens for Sustainable Pensions had mentioned, but they were really concerned that reserves hadn't been set aside for the next generation system, and that in going forward, we're still going to be paying for the next gen, or for the first generation, as well as the second generation. And I think another thing I heard was that cities are more in control of their own finances, but because it's a county-wide and up to a lot of, under the wings of a lot of different jurisdictions, it's perhaps more difficult to control the spending. So I think, and then finally, the agencies said that they would implement MIRA regardless of whether it passed or not. What it's going to do is put a lot more stress on city and county budgets. But for instance, in Novato, we'll have an extra $250,000 a year that we'll have to spend, and then it'll go to $500,000 a year onward. So it will be a hit, but I think had agencies anticipated and set money aside, it would mean that there was less money for higher compensation, higher salaries, and when you get higher compensation and salaries, you do get more pension costs. As far as the state elections, I think, and I'll hit the Jared Huffman too at the in the U.S. Congress. Huffman, Mike McGuire, and Mark Levine all are really personable fellows that take time to meet with their local constituents and really listen to what they want. We don't agree with everything for sure, but I know that there were a lot of, not only did they get the vote of the Democrats, but a lot of Republicans voted for them too, because they just are really good, solid folks. And that's what I think people are looking for across the country, is people that will listen and understand what the issues are and then actually get something accomplished. So I think in the state, I think I was surprised that the Democrats lost the supermajority in the Assembly. I don't think we know yet the Senate. But I think regardless of what your party is, it's a two-party system, and I think it really helps to have two parties represented. And but just like on the local nonpartisan level, you have to find ways to work together to get things accomplished. You need to listen to your constituents and move forward. You cannot hold the system hostage. People across the country want something to happen, and I think the voters did speak. The Proposition 2, and then I'm going to wrap it up here. Proposition 2, I think Jerry Brown has done a couple of really good things. One, I think Proposition 2, which is voters really want government to be good stewards of finances. And what he said is, for rainy days, when we have excess revenues, we're going to put it aside. That often didn't happen. Everybody spent more. So just like at home, you have to save money, and you have to put money aside, and so that you don't have the boom and bust. And so I think the other thing Jerry's done, of course, is put in some modest pension reforms. CalPERS is trying to unravel those. As one of the League of California Cities League of California Cities consultants said, basically, no, I wasn't, I'm sorry, I've just lost the word. Basically, Brown is the only adult in the room when it comes to talking about pensions in Sacramento. I mean, he really is trying to hold the line and understands that something has to happen for us to have sustainable budgets. So I'm going to let these other two fine gentlemen speak to some of the other issues. Thank you.
Friends, colleagues, fellow political junkies. 5, oh man. All right, I'm going to just hit on a few of the highlights that surprised me and try to end with some good news because some of us Democrats are a little depressed, but Jeanne, our nominal Republican here, I figured would be way too nice to gloat, and sure enough, she's way too nice to gloat. Everybody has their favorite political websites. A lot of you like maybe Nate Silver's 538.com. I prefer one called electoral-vote.com. And every day, for months before every election, they have great articles, they have great charts and maps, and they compile all the polls. And unlike some people, I believe in polls. Polls are nearly always right, except this year. Even Nate Silver missed one, but he is renowned for very rarely missing out on he's very accurate. This time, the polls were relatively stable, I thought. I was watching every day to see which U.S. Senate races were within a few points. And I harbored this idea that the Democrats would pull it out because it seemed to me that 2 years ago and even 4 years ago in what was called a big Republican wave, and certainly 6 years ago and some other times, that Democrats would outperform the polls. And I saw several articles as to why that is true. And so I was thinking the same thing would happen this time. And there were 4, 5, 6, it changed a little bit, races that were within a point or 2 or 3 or 4 that I thought the Democrats would pull out. Not only did they not pull any of them out, they got creamed by 5 or 10 or more points in nearly all of them. The ones which the Democrats won were few and far between, as you all know. New Hampshire, about as predicted, a couple of points. New Hampshire was supposed to be a big win for the Democrats. He won by 1 point. In Virginia, excuse me. And so it was... It's hard to find glimmers of good news, but you all probably have seen or heard or read, looking ahead 2 years, where the reverse will be true. Of the 34 seats that are up, 24 of them will be Republicans, including about 7 in blue or at least purple states. And of course, in presidential years, Democrats always do much better because there's a much better Democratic turnout. So I predict that the Democrats will retake the Senate in 2 years. It's hard to know how many seats they will take. A lot can happen between now and then. The other lesson is that you can't take anything from one election to the next. What happened last week is not going to have any impact on 2 years from now. Hillary Clinton has an astounding lead in the polls, not just for the Democratic nomination, but over all the Republicans by an incredible number of points, even in red states. I've never seen anything like it. Now, is it going to stay that way for the next 2 years? Probably not. It'll get a lot closer. But she has such a strong lead at this point, it's really astounding. Now, she was a front runner 8 years ago, and look what happened. But I think she's much stronger now than she was then, and it's hard to imagine anybody stopping her or even slowing her down much. So I'm very optimistic about Hillary Clinton and retaking the Senate 2 years from now, and who knows what will happen, and maybe another Democratic wave. We've got a bigger hill to climb to retake the House. At the state level, the other thing that shocked me was the governor's races. I kept looking at the polls for the governor's races, and I thought, well, the Democrats are poised to knock off a bunch of Republican governors and win a whole bunch of new governorships. They knocked off one Republican incumbent governor in Pennsylvania by 10 points, as the polls predicted. But there again, the polls were way off in many cases, and a lot of Democrats that were predicted to win did not. A lot of Democrats lost their seats in relatively blue states like Massachusetts and Maryland and Illinois. So it was kind of a depressing night all around. I think I read 23 states now are controlled by Republican governors and both houses of their legislature. Only 7 states have Democratic governors and both houses of their legislature. So we're definitely in a hole we've got to climb out from, we Democrats. Let me get on, because I could go on forever about the national level, but I want to cover some state things and some local things. On the state level, as expected, the Democrats won all 8 statewide offices. Some were a little close, but we won them all. It wasn't too surprising. And on the propositions, I think Jeanne mentioned them. 1 and 2 won, probably primarily because Jerry Brown used most of his $24 million whatever war chest to campaign for Props 1 and 2. 1 minute? Holy smokes. All right. You all know about the props. You all know about statewide offices. And you all know about Jared Huffman and Mike McGuire and Mark Levine, 70-something% of the vote, which is surprising in the case of McGuire and Huffman, because those northern counties are mostly Republican, and yet they still got 70% of the vote overall, which means they probably got 80-something% in Marin and Sonoma, which are heavily Democratic. On the local level, I just want to make a couple of points, and then I want to leave you with some good news in my 30 seconds. I'm sure we'll get into the water board race and the healthcare district race and Measure A and Measure R. which Measure A I think could still win, because if you all read the IJ, I'm sure you all do. Last Friday's updates showed that they overcame 1/5 of the deficit in Measure A with 1/5 of the outstanding votes counted. And even Lisa Cross, for whom the trends were bad, she was down 5 points when the polls closed. She was up 5 points when the polls closed. She was down 3 points at the end of the night. But she made up 1/3 of her deficit, I think, if I read my numbers right, with 1/5 of the votes counted. So those two are still too close to call. I just want to say, be grateful for some things. We got the county of Hawaii, the Big Island, I think, required GMO labeling. There was a couple of corporate personhood amendments which lost. That was a good thing. Depending on how you feel about marijuana, I think it's a good liberal trend that brings out Democrats, and it makes me think we should have put it on the ballot in California this year. We might have done better in California rather than lose a few congressional seats and Senate seats and Assembly seats. Thanks. Here's Brad.
Greg, I'd like to thank the Marin Women's PAC for having me again, and I have the luxury of getting to focus on local news and focus on Marin. Generally during the presidential elections, every once in a while I'll get a call from somebody who says, who do you think is going to win the presidential race? And I always tell them the same thing, that I can predict how Marin's going to vote, but it's really hard to predict how the rest of the country east of like Vallejo is going to vote. And because I'm so focused here, it's like, you know, I'm really not in tune with what's going on in Placerville. What I like to do is sort of give you guys some nuances of the race, and I quickly drilled down into some numbers of the city by city results. And it shows that while we all have we talk about how Marin votes and and we try to like generically put everybody in the same pot, it's different from city to city. In fact, it's widely different from city to city. I guess first off, I think Ross deserves some credit, according to these preliminary results, for having the best turnout in the election. It was probably close, maybe better than 60%. Mill Valley had the worst, which is unusual because Mill Valley's usually turns out. In Fairfax, Jerry Brown got a stronghold on the voters. Jerry Brown won with 91.6% of the votes in Fairfax. And in Kamala Harris, while Kamala Harris received 88% of the vote in Fairfax for re-election as Attorney General. In Ross, she didn't do, she won, but she won with 58%, something like that. That must not be right, because it doesn't add up.
That's probably the largest Democratic majority Ross has had.
Oh, she got 57.6. And then Levine, another interesting example is the Marshall Tuck Tom Torlakson race. And in Marin, Torlakson won with 62% majority, but in Ross he got only 55.7, or in Ross he got 55.7, and in Belvedere it was 52.4%, which shows sort of the support of a more conservative trend and a call for reform that Marshall Tuck was pushing. Another interesting thing was the Bragman-Cross race, wherein you can get the results broken down by supervisorial district. And Bragman won in District 2, which is Katie Rice's seat, and he had 52%. But in District 4, Steve Kinsey's seat, Lisa had 59%. The big difference is that within this MMWD division, there are, which don't exactly follow supervisorial lines, there are 8 times more voters in Katie Rice's 2nd district than in Steve Kinsey's 4th district. And the other big factor in that race, and it, like Greg said, is too early to call it, is that Larry received 65% of the vote in Fairfax, and that's a big deal. The only Republican who actually won in Marin in that city was Pete Peterson, the Secretary of State candidate. He had 50% of the vote in Belvedere. And then on Measure A, one example why Measure A is having problems is that while Mill Valley voted 74.4% in favor of Measure A, Novato, it was 59.9, which it needed 2/3 to win. And in San Rafael, it was 64.9. So if you take those, and these are all before all the votes are counted, but if you take those two big cities and they don't have a majority, it doesn't really bode well for Measure A's chances, but it may be too early to call. Generally, overall, this election was really nice. I've had elections where there's like 100 candidates that the editorial board has to schedule and meet with and talk about local issues with. This time it was probably maybe 8 or 10. So I really appreciated it. But I do know that the other cycle's coming. It always comes back. And it was an interesting race. I think I tend to agree with our columnist Dick Spotswood, who said that the protest vote was a factor. I don't know if it was a prevailing factor. I mean, I was talking to some pension reform people who were claiming victory and said that most of the voters saw things their way. And I reminded them that Measure A, which was the top of their campaign ticket, had it's still too soon to call, and it got 66%, which in any kind of contest would be like a whopping majority. And then in the Lisa Cross Larry Bragman race, it was sort of the strange combination of first off, the environmental vote was split down the middle between the Marin Conservation League and other groups, and then you had Larry did a great job of making the use of pesticides on Mount Tam a big campaign issue. But what was interesting with Bragman's campaign is he also attracted the people who were fearful of high-density housing in Marin. And that's a strange, they're not always the same bedfellows, but Larry was able to bring these two together, and so it made for an interesting campaign. Anyway.
Thank you. I see one hand here, Vivian.
Well, I think Greg brought up polling, and it reminded me, I don't know how many of you remember when Dianne Feinstein ran against Pete Wilson for governor. We're talking 24 years ago, 20-something years ago. And the poll showed that, I can't remember, I think Pete Wilson, I remember the Chronicle had a headline about this. Help me out, Brad. I think Pete Wilson was so ahead in the polls that it discouraged people from even coming out to vote. Dianne needed 3 votes in Northern California for every 1 vote that was going to come from Southern California to balance it out. And polls are used quite often as a matter of dissuading voters. Oh, so what do you think about that, Brad?
Brad, okay.
You want us to stand up each time?
They've got the microphone in their hand.
No, he's good.
Oh, there's
No.
another one? Oh, sorry. Okay, your microphone.
I think polls are a factor, because if somebody sees that a certain number of candidates are so far ahead, they say, why bother? My vote doesn't count. And in Marin, I think we're seeing that in terms of I mean, this is a county that had a 91% turnout when Obama first won his first term as president. And we're going to be lucky to get around mid-50s and 60% in this race. And I think a lot of it is because people weren't driven to the polls by any really sizable contests for governor. It was or governor and all the other seats, because everybody was, all the polls showed there was a runaway. And it wound up being a runaway. And the Republican Party didn't exactly put up stellar candidates. And I have to admit that I do agree with Greg on one thing. Greg once came to our editorial board and said that we were talking about why city councils should or shouldn't take positions on national and international matters. And the IJ's always been strongly opposed to doing this. But Greg pointed out that most people, that's what most people care about. That's what they're focused on. They're not focused on whether or not there should be cheaper parking in San Rafael. They're not focused on, if you don't have kids in the school, you're really not focused on whether or not they should change the hours. You probably should be, because it means something about traffic, but you aren't. People are focused on the governor's race, senator races, and that's what brings people to the polls. And it wasn't much of a race this time, and I think that's why we're seeing the turnout so poor across the state. And even in Marin, which usually has bragging rights for some of the highest turnouts in California.
Okay, any more questions? I'm sure there are. Let's see, here.
Yeah, okay, it's actually a question for you.
Speak up.
Yeah, just real quick, again, Kevin Herhoff. I'd be interested to hear your take on the water district race. One of the things that kind of defined the two campaigns, just one of them, was Lisa's ability to get a lot of endorsements. Compared to Larry obviously had what he had, but Lisa got a long list. And yet the contest remained as close as it still is. So I guess, do you have a sense of whether that sends a signal to whether, or anything about the value of endorsements?
I think in two things. I think in large part endorsements play a bigger role before candidates decide whether they're going to challenge the incumbent or the front runner. Because if they have all the endorsements lined up, the challenger goes, well, why bother? I think that both candidates had pretty impressive support from different camps, but I think Lisa had strong support from sort of the old-time Marin conservation standards, and then Larry was able to make the use of pesticides on Mount Tam a prevailing issue. And if you think about it, the opponents of Lisa Cross basically said that she was, she was having ortho spray the entire peak of Mount Tam and all the entire watershed. I mean, it was pretty bold, but Monsanto, and he was able to get that message out to voters. So the voters sat there and said, "Okay, am I pro spray or not?" Even though the water districts never really talked about spraying, they've been talking about applying herbicides. But I just thought he did a masterful job of capturing that issue and delivering it to voters. And and we got tons of letters on both sides, and we got tons of complaint calls about all the letters not getting in. But we ran tons and tons of letters on the issue. So I think it was pretty balanced, and it's an interest. It is too close to call, and but I do think Larry did a great job, and he was able to resonate within his district.
I have a couple thoughts on that race, if I may. Usually when you challenge an incumbent, the incumbent has far better name recognition and is considered to have far more experience, and the challenger is an underdog. This race presented a different scenario because Lisa Cross was probably not well known, did not have a lot of name recognition, and Larry Bragman did as an 11-year council member from Fairfax. But I just want you to consider that it's not always true that the candidate, as you all know, with the most endorsements gets to win. We all can think of lots of examples where that is not the case. 12 years ago, Paul Cohen and Susan Adams for one. But even in the water board, I mean, how many of you political junkies go back about 20 years or whenever it was when Morrow Cater had all the endorsements and the money, and an unknown guy who was a Sierra Club guy from named Alex Foreman walked the heck out of the district and won. So it happens even on the water board. And so it was a little closer than some people thought that Lisa, with all her early endorsements, would sew things up. But I agree with what Brad said about Larry did a really good job in pointing out the importance of the spraying issue. I just, as I left my office an hour or two ago, saw something on an email about how yet another country banned glyphosate to join Mexico and it listed a half dozen other countries. So a lot of other people are doing this. This is not some wild, crazy fear. A lot of people are really concerned about it. Yes, there were differences of opinion as to whether or not they're talking about spraying or applying dabs, daubing the stalks of the broom. But anyway, it's understandably a close race for those reasons. Larry Bragman is a bright, articulate guy. He's used to stand up in front of a jury. He can usually certainly stand up and make his case politically after 11 years on the council. And Lisa did a great job too. She had a lot of background in water and apparently well respected. When I first heard she had the endorsement of, I think, 4 out of the 5 members of the Board of Soups, all the ones that endorsed, and the entire water board, I thought, well, that's pretty strong support in her favor, but a lot of people saw that as the problem.
Okay. Jeanne, you want to talk about the
Oh,
water board?
I think I'd just say that more about endorsements, that it can work to your advantage and not. When I first ran, I had some endorsements, not a whole lot, because I'm first time running. It depends on how people feel about the incumbents. If they want to throw all the bums out, the incumbents, then maybe the endorsements aren't so great. So I think your message, to me, is the most important. What message do you get out? And if you don't get some key endorsements, well, you got to keep working. You got to go door to door, and that's in Marin at the local level. That's what we can do, is go door to door. So I wouldn't not somebody that's really passionate and wants to be of service. They shouldn't let the lack of endorsements hold them back from running.
Okay, any more questions? Tammy and then Joan.
This is more a question for Brad.
Brad.
I'm just curious with the IJ, what was it the Lisa Cross, Larry Bragman race, or was it the Measure A? Which one got you like the most letters, the most?
Oh, Lisa Cross, Larry Bragman race by far. First, the first couple weeks of like post Labor Day was when things start cooking in the elections, and we were getting swamped with Lisa Cross letters, and then the Bragman camp woke up and realized that they weren't getting any letters in, and then we started getting swamped with Bragman letters, and then at the end we got swamped with everybody's letters, and then usually on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, when I came in on Monday before the election, we had probably 12 more letters to the editor that weren't going to get in because everybody waited till the last minute. And I sent a lot of them back notes saying, I know you had your mind made up 2 months ago, couldn't you have written this letter then? So we got a ton. On Measure A, we didn't get many. We got a lot from the pension reform people, and we got a few in favor of Measure A. I think I'm not sure why the Measure A people didn't. The pro Measure A people didn't get their act together and have more letters of support, because obviously they've got, I don't know how many agencies, was it 30 agencies or something like that involved? I mean, you got 30 agencies multiplied by 5, you got a lot of letter writers. But in fact, this election, was unusual because for a lot of times, for the last 10 days, I'll be squeezing in as many election letters as I can. This time I had a lot of letters that had nothing to do with the election whatsoever. It might have had to do with Spare the Air Day or the same housing debate that we've been running, but there weren't Bregman and Lisa Cross basically dominated the letters the editor.
Plus you shortened your space in the newspaper.
Okay, Joan? Joan, you want to ask a question?
Yes, I did. I was watching the results from a national perspective and the influence that might have on our county and the state of California. And my question is, because of what happened in Richmond, everyone watched the mayor's race and how much money that was poured into that. I want to know if Citizens United had any influence on races here and more importantly throughout the state. How much influence, and whether that can be answered by either Brad or Greg.
Okay, for those that don't know, in Richmond, California, there was a hotly contested race for mayor and city council. Chevron Corporation put $3 million against what they call Team Richmond, which is a progressive alliance in Richmond, and to try to defeat them, and they had some kind of fancy sounding name. But the thing that was interesting there is that they did not hide behind Citizens United. They were clear that they were Chevron.
Well, everyone knew that.
Yeah, so, and they were defeated soundly. The Chevron candidates were defeated soundly, so it didn't work there. I guess if you know who's behind the money, it makes a difference. So yeah, Greg and...
6.2 million.
That's right, okay, maybe Greg would talk to that.
You want to say anything, Jeanne? I have some opinions about that, but it's amazing that we have not seen much in the mainstream media about the actual dollars. Thank you, Greg, for mentioning. Yes, ever since Citizens United, the amount of money put out by the super PACs, which are now basically free of restraints, has increased largely. But some of us, including me, thought it would go up faster. Perhaps the only restraint was like what happened in Richmond. If they spent too much, too fast, too suddenly, people would react negatively and vote against their candidates. So I think they've been going up slowly. However, I think last week was a real test when and the Democrats are getting wise too and saying, well, they've learned how to use the Koch brothers as the boogeymen to say, do you want the Koch brothers to buy this, this election? Over and over again, hundreds of emails every day for months. But I think last week, when the Koch brothers and the mostly right-wing, not exclusively, billionaires found that they could put in more and more money and win more and more elections without the kind of backlash which resulted in them getting defeated, I really worry about 2 years from now when they may make a quantum leap and say, I guess we can do this with impunity. So it is a very important issue, a very real concern, and even more than Citizens United 4 years ago, I worry about McCutcheon earlier this year, which even further loosened the restrictions. And until we get a constitutional amendment to saying money is not speech, that would overturn Buckley versus Valeo from 1976, and the corporations are not people, then that's what it's going to take to change this huge influx of money, more and more of it uncontrolled by any candidate.
Brad? Don't feel obligated to talk on everything.
It's pretty obvious that Citizens United hasn't really played a role in Marin. It's probably played a role in terms of people in Marin, writing checks to support candidates, red or blue, that outside of the county. But in Marin, it's been fairly. It was pretty much a Democratic runaway for the legislative positions that are generally going to attract those large donations. And in Marin, and I'm proud to say this, Marin voters have a history, a tradition of having a low resilience toward people trying to buy elections. Marin, it goes back. There's a lot of elections where candidates were far outspent, and they still won. And I think a large part is because the underdog candidate, or the person who's spending all the money, turns voters away from them. I remember during the, I guess it was the Michael Allen race, people were calling me all the time and complaining about the fact that Michael Allen was running ads in the middle of the Giants game, and that it just showed how much money he had and things like that. And I think Michael Allen had a job where he was the sort of the seated assemblyman, but nobody knew him in Marin, and he felt that the way to win the race was spend money and let people know who he was. The problem was he spent so much money that people were just totally turned off, and they turned to Levine, who's now got tons of money. But I do think you run the risk with Marin voters sometimes of spending too much money and making people feel like somebody's trying to buy your vote.
Okay.
I just add one quick thing too. I think Brad, you're absolutely right, and I think the other thing is that some of us at the local level also don't take money from various interest groups because we don't want it to even have a whiff of a possibility that we're influenced by money. So, we don't take money from labor, don't take money from developers that are doing business in town. So we each have different standards by which we go by, but we don't make enough money at the council job. We make $400 a month. It costs each constituent 50 cents a year to have 5 council members on the Novato City Council. So as the Russians that came to visit one time, they said, well, gosh, if you're not getting paid directly, what's going on under the table? But with the Brown Act, that keeps all that real clean too. So anyway, money in Marin, I think, doesn't talk, and that's great.
Can I just make one quick, response to Brad's and Jeanne's comment? Just a reminder on the Michael Allen campaign 2 years ago, most of that money was not Michael Allen's. It was special independent expenditure money from the California Democratic Party, which, according to most opinions, really screwed up. They went overboard with way too many mailers, at least a dozen. They were really stupid mailers. And you're right, they pissed everybody off about Michael Allen, even though he had nothing to do with them. Yes, Michael Allen had plenty of money and sent plenty of mailers, but most of them were from the state Democratic Party, which really screwed up. Jeanne, it is true that there is such a thing as toxic donors, particularly on the state level or the federal level. You want to be careful, especially if you're a Democrat, about taking oil money or tobacco money or something. But I don't know that there's many examples you could name of toxic donors at the local level. It's probably a good idea if you don't take developer money, and that almost never happens anymore. It used to be 10, 20 years ago, it was the developers versus the environmentalists. But developers are not playing so much anymore. They don't contribute a lot of money to too many local candidates that I've seen. At least they're very low key about it. And unions, I just want to clarify that I don't know too many people that would refuse union monies, but contrary to popular belief, I hate it when I see people like Spotswood and others that say that the Democratic Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of the union movement. That's ridiculous. I don't know a single race where unions have contributed more than 5 or 10% of any candidate's race. 5 or 10%. That means individual unions may be giving 1% of, so who's going to get bought for that? I'm done.
Okay. Questions. I had a hand here.
Yeah.
And then Frank, and then Carol, and then Pam, and then.
Yeah, I'd like to ask both Greg and Brad, what do you think the meaning or the message of the overwhelming 78% passage of Measure R? Thank you for an endorsement, by the way.
Good question. I was surprised at the level of opposition. I didn't think there'd be that much. And ironically, it was many of the real super activists that, and I was among them, I wasn't maybe one of the super activists, that fought Sutter 10 years ago, whenever it was, for quite a number of years. And most of them feared, wrongly, I think, that Measure R would be a replay of the Sutter situation where the local elected board was turning over control to a privately elected board. What they weren't quite I can't say they didn't know it because they were told it, obviously, and it was all over all the literature and all everything, is that, no, this is different. The one corporate member is the elected Marin Healthcare District Board, not Sutter. And the elected board has the right to dissolve the private board. But I guess they were so fearful after that horrible battle with Sutter for so many years. And Sutter, everybody agreed by the end. Sutter was really bad, so I can understand them being fearful. That's what. So I was amazed that it won so overwhelmingly. Most people finally bought the arguments. No, this isn't Sutter Redux. This is a different, more protected situation where the elected board still has much more control than they ever did under Sutter.
I think the people, the voters of Marin had been paying attention for 20 years, and they saw how the animosity and the dysfunction of the old battles. And I don't think they wanted to go back. And I think the voters said that overwhelmingly with the percentage by which Measure R passed. Is the debate over with? No. Are people still going to raise questions about the new corporate boards? Yes, and they should. But I do think that people realized, the voters realized that there was a need for a firewall, and they also realized that they didn't want to see a replay of what had taken place for 25 years.
Okay, Frank, and then
Sure.
Carol.
In speaking to Measure R, the Yes on Measure R group spent probably close to $400,000 of public taxpayers' money supporting Measure R. What's interesting is they put out about 5 mailers that went to the whole district. One of the mailers came out and said, "Why do nurses support Measure R?" What's interesting is the 2 labor groups that represent most of all the workers at Marin General Hospital, the nurses and the Teamsters. Those 2 unions opposed Measure R. The California Nurses Association opposed Measure R. The Teamsters Union opposed Measure R. And yet that message just didn't get out.
What's the question?
The question is, how can a public agency use $400,000 of public tax money to promote their measure?
And lie about it.
The nurses did not support Measure R. The nurses were against Measure R.
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if you do. Maybe Larry or or Sharon or somebody that's been associated with the healthcare district. Do you have a comment?
Well, I think the money was from the corporation that runs Marin General Hospital, not from the Marin Healthcare District. And you can figure out that it's probably from the same source, but it's got different letterhead on the signature, and we see that all the time. I mean, why does Mira get to spend $200,000 of taxpayer money to sort of prime the pump to get their ballot measure passed? Or how about all the school districts that all of a sudden, right before a ballot measure, they send out all these glossy mailers and tell people what a great job their schools are doing. And they are, and how much they need for classroom teachers and how much they need for new buildings. But you know, for like 20 months before that, they didn't really care. You know, all of a sudden they care about the voters because in like 6 months it's going to be on the ballot. So I think there is some question about crossing the fine line of the use of public funds, and it would be great. I think it's a perfect subject for the Fair Political Practices Commission to take up, and it's not just with Marin General, but I think it has to do with the counties and the cities and things like that and their use of public funds. And to tell you the truth, Frank, I hardly got any letters on Measure R. And we got some at the end, but for a race that at one time would consume 20% of my time of people calling and bending my ear about one side or the other, Measure R was really quiet. And nurses and the nurses union and the Teamsters, they're not exactly quiet, but they weren't writing a lot of letters or anything like that.
Okay,
Can I comment?
Wait.
Can I piggyback on that?
Did you wanna? All right, well, I don't want this to turn into a whole discussion on
We're not debating, no big.
one thing.
Well, I have a question
So-
about the future of women in politics.
Then
So
you.
something very,
Wait, she's calling on someone else.
Well, actually, Carol was next, so let's just go in order, and if you wanna, and then Pam, you're after her, so if you wanna take it back to that, that's fine.
Sure.
yeah, I was just thinking about, the fact that, California has been so fortunate between Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer and Nancy Pelosi, and all of them actually are getting older. So, Greg or anybody else, what do you think about the future for women politicians in this state? What can we look forward to?
So I'm not Brad or Dave, but I'll answer anyway, since I am a woman in politics. But I think politics is the perfect place for women to participate, as in anything, any profession that they desire to participate in. And I think it's just a matter, one of these days, we're going to have a woman president. Who knows which side of the aisle she'll be on, but at any rate, I think there was a woman, she is a Republican, but I think the first black woman won in Utah, the Congress, and somehow her message resonated. So I think there are great women all across this country, no matter what party, and I encourage all of you that know really fine, wonderful gals to have them step up and participate.
Can you talk about Barbara Boxer?
Yes.
And
We love Barbara Boxer, especially in this county and especially in this group. My guess is that she steps down. She hasn't been raising money recently, although she did this once about 12 years ago too, and then she scrambled and decided to run again after all. I think she's 74 or something. But my guess is she doesn't run again, so we'll need a new senator in 2 years, and my guess is she'll announce soon to give somebody some time to run. We're also going to need a new governor in 4 years. Most people would agree that the two brightest rising stars in the Democratic Party are, in no particular order, Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris. I just hope they don't both run for the same office. One of them should run for senator and one should run for governor. Sometimes I think, well, Gavin would be logical to run for governor because he's lieutenant governor, and Kamala can go to Washington as a senator, but somebody convinced me the other day that it should be the other way around, because despite the fact that Gavin Newsom had a pretty good reputation as mayor of San Francisco, somebody said, he's not really an administrator. He's an idea guy. He'd be better as a legislator. He should go to senator, to Washington. And Kamala should be governor because she has been an administrator as the district attorney of San Francisco, and now the attorney general. Lieutenant governor doesn't do all that much. So take your pick, but hopefully those two will be our next U.S. senator and governor.
Okay, and Pam,
I just want to comment on Measure R, being a 30-year union nurse at Marin General. I do not know one nurse that supported Measure R. So in those mailers, I was sort of blown away to see nurses support Measure R. And that really bothered me, that message. And it was like 40 to 1 from what Frank told me. The CNA got a slow start on this whole campaign, and it flopped. I don't think people really understood where the nurses were coming from. I think the new board has a lot of work to do with the nurses, that there's a major divide. So that's kind of where I'm at. And to see $300,000 plus go to the mailers and what have you is very bothering to me. The other thing I wanted to point out was that the bond, the $300 million bond, was passed before the lease, which seems kind of strange. I would think that the lease would be passed before the bond. So if anybody has any comments to that, I would really appreciate it.
anything here, or here's a move on to something else? Okay, let's move on to something else. Are you going to talk about the lease? No, okay. Do you want to say something about that? I mean, I don't think we need to keep this.
Well, I mean, if she wants an answer, let's meet after, I'll give you an
Yeah,
answer.
okay, let's do it that way. The next person in order that we're calling on is David, and then Sharon after that.
I was going to say not on Measure R.
Not on Measure R, please.
I'm wondering whether any of you panelists would agree with this. There's a certain component of the electorate which is just flat out anti-government and distrustful, particularly of bureaucrats, but also stridently anti-government. Some of that seems to be aligned with wanting to unelect Democrats at the county level. But I think a component of the Measure A vote, from my perspective, and listening to the next door commentary, is folks who just wanted to say no to government. And now it's emerging, in fact, as an additional, let's have the county registrar be an elective office as opposed to an appointed office move, which I heard this weekend. Just curious if any of you might agree with that.
Thank you. I do have some feelings about that. I read somewhere the other day that it's not that people across the country were voting against Democrats. If they'd been mostly Republicans in office, they would have voted against them because there's a big throw the bums out mentality. Now, throw the bums out, anti-incumbent is not necessarily the same as being anti-government, but I agree with you that, although this anti-government, ebbs and wanes, it's particularly strong now. We certainly saw it about the Board of Supervisors in June. I think we're seeing it more and more at more and more levels in more and more places in Marin and California and across the country. Often it's the people on the left like to say that that's a Tea Party, but I think there's an element of the far left which feels that way too. The way I always put it is that yes, you have to keep a close eye on government, and I'm sure Brad would be the first to agree with that. And yes, they sometimes screw up, and yes, you have to watch them and correct them when you think they're wrong. But what makes me really uncomfortable is to see people just assume that anybody in government is by definition evil or incompetent and they're out to screw you and you have to stop them. It really bothers me, and I'm seeing more and more of that, and it makes me very uncomfortable because I think most of the time people at all levels of government, especially local government, get it right. People and the voters get it right, and they elect people that are good-hearted and they have good intentions and they do a good job, and once in a while, you need a slight course correction, but not a general overhaul. When you see the statistics nationally about how many people think that if they could throw out every member of Congress, they would do so, it's a majority. It's a majority. So it is scarce.
Except for their own.
Except for their own, yeah. But actually, I saw one poll that said, including your own, would you throw everybody out? If you could throw everybody else out, they said, yes, I'd even give up my own, if I could get rid of all of them. So, I don't know, it's particularly bad. I mean, the Board of Supervisors is always a target, but it's more so than ever this past year or two. This wasn't true 2 years ago. 2 years ago, 3 supervisors were reelected, one without an opponent, but the other 2 had serious opponents, and they won handily by large margins against serious opponents. Look at the difference in 2 years and what happened this June.
Well, on the Board of Supervisors, I think we went a long time without having any races. We had a situation where incumbents just sort of walked in without any opposition. And I think the incumbents pay a price for that because they don't mount a campaign, and they don't go knocking on doors, and they don't engage voters. They lose contact with the voters, and the voters lose contact with them because they don't, they haven't been, I guess, involved and included in the decision making. I do think that I don't think you could take Measure A. Measure A is like too close to call. I think, when you get 65% vote for something, that's a pretty sizable majority that I think most people would any candidate would gladly have 65%. Now, is there frustration? Yeah, there's frustration among the pension reform people because the Board of Supervisors won't go as far as they want them to. There's frustration over the housing issue. Concerned that Sacramento or ABAG or somebody like that is actually calling the shots rather than the local city councils. And I don't know if the local city councils have really gotten the message across to the voters that they're in charge and they're not getting pushed around. Because a lot of times they'll be the first one to say, well, we're only doing this because we have to do it because ABAG sets these numbers and we have to hit them. I mean, look what's going on in Corte-Madera where the council says we screwed up and we wouldn't have done it if ABAG been pushing us into it. And that doesn't resonate with voters, and I don't think that local governments really done a great job of I guess addressing this issue and actually telling people their role in this whole process.
Okay, got something to say about that. Anyway, first of all, people are really upset when you impact their pocketbook or their property. And that's why we had such a big dust-up over housing. And Novato had a big dust-up 2-3 years ago, as you may recall. We'd just come off our 50th celebration of incorporation. We thought everybody loved each other, and we just had a great time, and they trusted us. And then all of a sudden, 300 people show up at the council meeting. We've never seen them before, and they're very upset because we're going to put 15 affordable housing projects in all their neighborhoods. Okay, so what we said as a city, we don't buy what the state's trying to tell us that we're metropolitan. We are suburban, and we drew the line, and we said no more than 20 units an acre or 30 for a senior. And we went out to prove that we could actually get some affordable housing built at that density. We got testimony from developers and so forth, and we ended up negotiating with HCD, and we got what we wanted. And we ended up, instead of 15 sites, we ended up with 5 sites, because we said, you only want 200, that's all we're gonna give you. And so we couldn't wait for legislation. We had to act on our own, because Huffman had tried to take it in the assembly. They wouldn't even talk about Marin, because they thought we were all stuck up and snobs, and we're a bunch of NIMBYs, which is not true, I don't believe. And so we had to move on our own. We had to do our own work, and we had a great staff working on it. We had lots of discussions with HCD. So local jurisdictions do not have to be, well, let me say this, it's very hard not to be pushed around by the state, but more and more they're going to take more of our local land use controls away from us, and we've got to hold the line, and we've got to all work together on it. And what Mark Levine said, he said he got this latest density designation for Marin changed to 20 units an acre, except along transit. But he got it because over his period in the assembly, he's been working with assembly people around the state on issues that they're concerned about too. And so he works with them, listens to their concerns, and then when it comes time for him to have an issue, they're more willing to work with him. And he said that's why he got something passed this time.
Okay, Sharon, do you remember what question you were going to ask?
Not a question, correction of fact.
Correction of fact.
Marin General Hospital has no tax revenue. In 1978, when Prop 13 passed, we were not exercising our taxing authority. There are in California 2 districts that have no tax revenue. The other one is the Petaluma district. So we have no tax revenue. So whatever you think about what was done, it wasn't tax money. It was earned revenue through the operations of the hospital. And it's important to realize, I think, in this kind of confused area, that the hospital is not spending public money.
Okay, thank you. This is not really a policy discussion. This is a question. Well, I want to make sure there are a lot of other people that have questions. So,
Or Larry.
Larry, did you still have a question? Did you ask a question before? I'm trying to get people who haven't asked yet.
I did ask a question. I promise it won't be about Measure R. It'll be more interesting,
Well,
more
let me see,
fun.
is there anybody else that hasn't asked? Tammy asked a question before. Is there anyone else without a question?
Here.
Lorraine.
Okay, Lorraine, and then we'll go to Larry and Tammy. Okay.
Okay, I
Just
know
like
that
fair.
you're not talking local, but it's still local. Would you please talk about Proposition 45 and the, what the media did and how facts were changed?
Thank you. I spent a lot of hours calling for Prop 45 in particular, as well as the other Democratic Party endorsed measures. We're all, well, especially in this group, well used to distortion in political mailers and political advertising, but I have rarely, if ever, seen anything like Prop 45. First of all, my pet peeve is, why does anybody put anything on the ballot? Why do they put a ballot measure up if they're not going to have the money to counteract what they know is going to be the onslaught? So I blame the proponents of Prop 45 for putting something up when they weren't going to have the 40 or 50 or 60 million dollars it would have taken to counteract this, because as soon as, in August, you started seeing TV ads and radio ads and lots of mailers coming, which they should have known was coming. But such distortion, you know, there's already an independent commission. There's no independent commission. There's Covered California, which is appointed by the governor, and they don't set rates, they advise on rates. And you know, one politician, the insurance commissioner, taking special interests. No Democrat has taken any money from the insurance industry in 12 years. I think last time there was a Republican in that office. So anyway, I could go on and on forever about why it was just blatantly misleading, but of course it carried the day. And as soon as I started seeing these, I said, this is going to go down big. Even though it started out with 70-80% of the polls, as they often do, it went way down because of this misleading, and there was no money to counteract it. So it was very sad, and to some extent, 46 set a similar fate, although I know there's a lot more split of opinion on that one.
Greg, can I ask you a question? While
Sure.
you're standing there as a Democrat, why was Nancy Pelosi against 45?
I think that persuaded a lot of Democrats.
She said it was
And
Obamacare.
A lot of people thought it would conflict with Obamacare. You know, Nancy Pelosi I love as much as anybody. I think she got it wrong in this case. I think Dave Jones is a very bright, articulate, smart guy who went to Harvard Law School, came back and worked for Legal Aid in Sacramento. Then he got in the city council, and then he got in the assembly, and now he's our state insurance commissioner. He's a fairly young guy. I don't think he's even 50 yet, and he's got a long way to go in politics. Would he risk sacrificing his political career, which could go on for a considerable amount of time, by doing something as stupid as pushing a measure like Prop 45 that's going to conflict with Obamacare? No, he would not. And who would know better than him? And he can hire the best experts in the state and the country. So I think he had it right, and Nancy Pelosi just got that one wrong, listened to some bad advice.
Brad, do you have a comment on that, or?
No,
Are
fine.
you okay?
We endorsed 45, by the way. We were one of the few newspapers that did.
Thank you.
Oh, wait.
But you didn't address about the media, I mean, the newspapers and the television.
Well, he did talk about the television ads. And
Okay. Okay.
So let's move on. And Larry, do you have something else that's not Measure R? And then
Sure.
Tammy.
One of the big winners, obviously, was marijuana. Alaska, Oregon, Washington, D.C. I have a conflict of interest. I chair a group called the Public Education Program Fund that's working to legalize marijuana in 2016. We're working with two different groups. It's going to be on the ballot, pass here in 4 states. One of the groups we're liaisoning with is Gavin Newsom. Much like gay marriage, he has come out for legalization, and the reason there was no initiative this year in 2016, a lot of young people show up, a lot of students, Afro-American, so it gives you about 6 votes or 6 points in legalization, and that's a defining issue between Harris and Gavin Newsom. She's supported by the police, opposed. You think that's gonna, I mean, has Newsom essentially declared a Senate candidate in 2016?
No, I don't think anybody's declared for anything yet, but I do want to hand it to Gavin Newsom, too, for the political courage it takes. Obviously, this is a very controversial topic, and again, lieutenant governors don't have a lot to do, so he's got some time on his hands. But he has taken upon himself to do a statewide study of this, and really is determined to see what works in Colorado and what doesn't, and what works in Oregon and what doesn't. And let's do it right in this state if we're going to do it. And I believe it, you know, I'm glad to hear you say I didn't know you were that involved. I know you were a little involved in it, but it will be on the ballot in 2 years. It will pass, and thanks to people like Gavin Newsom, I think they're going to try to get it right, because my personal view is that, you know, I have some mixed feelings. For 90% of people, like alcohol, it's probably fine, but what about the 10% that are addicts? That, you know, I just hope that there's a lot of money for, you know, addiction treatment, because some people contrary to popular belief, can get addicted to marijuana. It's not a good thing. There'll be a lot more people smoking it, and we have to educate people not to drive and smoke, and not for kids. And anyway.
Any other comments there, Brad?
I'm fine.
Okay.
I think in large part, and I think we said this in our editorial on Sunday, it's what your occupation is. If you go through the ballot and you go through the results, you'll notice, one thing you'll notice is that people sort of fall off as they get to the bottom of the ballot. And for instance, like on the college board races, the voter participation in college board races is usually 20% less than at the top of the ticket. And you find that also with Marin General Hospital or Marin Healthcare District. And I think doctors, nurses, Jennifer Rinks is a medical researcher. They've got the occupation next to their name that for the voter who's not living and breathing the issue, they say, well, Jesus, Marin Healthcare District, of course I want a health professional rather than the CPA. And I think we saw that with the election of the reform slate several years ago, where two local doctors, pretty well known, ran. And then actually we had three. We had three local doctors. It's really rare that if you're a doctor and you're running for Marin General Hospital, I can only think of one who lost over the past 10 years.
Yeah, I was going to say too, I came over to Larry just before the dinner just started and said, to what do you attribute the success of Jennifer Hirschon, the nurse? Just because people like nurses? He said yes. People do like nurses. But there's a history of splitting slates. There used to always be slates in the Marin Healthcare District race 6, 8, 10, 12 years ago. And as I recall, Jennifer Rinks was first elected around the same time you were as part of a different slate than you were on, when they picked two from your slate and one from her slate. And now that you two are on the same slate, so things change. What was Mike Whipple's ballot designation profession? CPA. And I just want the final point I want to make about this is that our democracy calls for lay, quote unquote, people to make policy decisions, and then they hire the professionals to run the city, the county, the school board, the special district. But increasingly sometimes it seems like I'm detecting a degree of specialization that didn't used to exist. The water board, for example, how many remember the race between Richard Rubin and Larry Russell about 6, 8 years ago? Richard Rubin had all the endorsements and the money. There's another example. And along comes some unknown named Larry Russell, who had a nickname Dr. Water because he was a water professional. People increasingly want a water professional now.
In a dirty mailer the weekend before.
Yes. But I think what won it for him is that he was well, I think Richard Rubin had lost that race before that dirty mailer. But anyway, the Bragman Cross race, I think, is an exception because neither one of them are really water professionals. But I think we've been seeing people, more specialization, people wanting more professional experience in the water board, and even more so in the healthcare district board, where they routinely elect mostly doctors, and those that aren't doctors are mostly nurses or PhD researchers, as you mentioned.
Teachers running for school boards.
Yeah.
Okay, question over here. Bob, go ahead.
For Brad.
Brad.
We've heard Greg just mentioned
Brad, take your
the
race.
The supervisor's race back in March got pretty ugly. Did you see much negative campaigning and the effects it had in this election?
By comparison?
No.
This was a walk in the park compared to past races.
Was there negative campaigning, and what did you see as the effect?
In this last race?
In this November race?
I think if there was negative campaigning, it had to do with the supporters of Bragman sort of enlarging the issue of the watershed protection, and Lisa, really, she's not a politician. She's sort of a public servant, but she's not used to stumping for votes. And I think she basically took the position that the water district's involved in this process, we've been involved in this process for 8 to 10 years, and we have to complete it, and I'm not going to prejudge my position on this race. And that left the door open for Larry to say, you know, well, I've got an opinion, and here it is. And my hunch is Lisa Cross would probably vote to not allow pesticides in the watershed anyway, but she didn't articulate that. But I don't think this was a dirty race at all. I mean, it honed in on the issue, and I think one side was able to articulate their position and attract voters' interests, and the other side wasn't. Now, who knows? I mean, maybe on Friday, Lisa gets reelected. But I think the reason why Larry had such success was because his message, people were attracted by his message and his promise that he wasn't going to use pesticides in the watershed.
I was at a candidates forum between Lisa Cross and Larry Bragman that Dick Spotswood moderated a few weeks ago, and he said at the end, and everyone agreed in this audience, this diverse bipartisan audience, that they were both extremely polite, extremely civil, no one attacking each other, each discussing in depth, very articulately the issues. It was really remarkable, much more so than usual. And I also attended a candidates forum or two of the Marin Healthcare District Board, and that was pretty clean also. They didn't really attack each other. The harshest thing I heard from someone who shall remain nameless is that those other candidates don't even attend the meetings of the Marin Healthcare District. And that's fair comment, that's fair, but it's not dirty. The last thing I want to say is nobody's mentioned the other, there were actually 4 if you count the Bolinas, Stinson Union School District, which nobody knew anything about, including me, but the Sausalito City Council. I was talking with Dick Spotswood on Saturday, and we did a post-election show last week, and he and I agreed that may have been the surprise and the shocker of the election, that you know, 2 incumbents were running. Everybody assumed that they'd win. Nobody knew anything about this challenger, Jill Hoffman, and she won, top vote getter by a considerable margin, and Jonathan Leone was the odd man out. Now, it wasn't anything against Jonathan Leone, I don't think, but Jill Hoffman, I think, articulated some of she's an ally of Linda Pfeiffer, articulated some of the anti-housing stuff, and she's a veteran, and she's an attractive woman, and that's enough to get you elected sometimes. And gender equity here. She beat Jonathan Leone, who was credited with his victory because he's a really handsome guy. This is not a gender-specific statement.
Thank you for the comment about Jill Hoffman. It is a lead-in to my question. Jill Hoffman ran a social media campaign with a great deal of help from Linda Pfeiffer. And my question is to Brad, as we jump forward a few years and we look at the balance of influence between print media, social media, emerging technologies, where's it going?
Oh, great.
Right, Brad, take it away.
Well, I think that the changes are fast and furious, but I still think that that print media will continue to be a factor. Social media is also a factor. However, we saw what happened to the patch, which you know, by all their readers' reception should have been wildly successful, but they couldn't get any ads, and they couldn't make it. In fact, one of the advocates for the patch said, and this was years ago, that they didn't think that the IJ would be in business and that patch would survive, and patch is sort of a shadow of itself now. I do think candidates are smart to use social media. I do think that it's one way to reach the voters. It's one of many ways to reach the voters. I do think that that Jill was able to hone in on an issue. Jill was able to say that she thought that the council was not listening to the people in their housing plans, that she felt that, I'm trying to remember her position, that she supported the pension reform, And she came out against the tax measure, which actually was approved by something like 61% of the voters. So the voters were sending sort of a mixed message there. But Jill was able to muster the support of sort of the people who were concerned about housing in Sausalito, and that lifted her above the two incumbents. I also think, and it's really hard to tell, but if you look at the results, if she was able to pull off bullet voting, I think this was a perfect example. But I also have, I guess, an inherent cynicism that nobody can really pull that off to such an extent to get that many votes based on bullet voting. If she was able to do it, God bless her. But because in bullet voting, you vote for one person,
Right.
and what you're doing is at the same time you're denying the two people you're running against for getting that second vote. But the key to it is you've got to have enough people who bullet vote to make a difference, and that's really hard. You can get like your 150 best friends, but it's it's a lot harder than that.
Anyone else want to take that? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope you had an enjoyable time, and we'll see you again. And please, if you're not a member of the Marin Women's PAC, we would love to have you as a member, and you can join tonight, or you can come to our holiday party. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks. And thanks to our panel. Thank you very much.
Sarah Palin?
No, Sarah Palin.